night may be long and the dark may be deep, but the answers are there to be found. Whether it's the normal, the abnormal, or the paranormal, you're in the right place. Let's go beyond reality.
Welcome to the program, everyone. It's Beyond Reality, and I'm your host, J.V. Johnson. And we're going to be talking about UFOs, aliens, crop circles, all things ET related, plus some other things, with a very, very well-known paranormal researcher and investigator and author, Nick Redfern. I think you could possibly join a book club that is exclusively Nick Redfern books, because he's got that many, like Book of the Month Club, Nick Redfern's Book of the Month Club. He's got that many. He's got a ton of books, and we're going to be talking about a bunch of them tonight. But specifically, we want to chat about things like I said, crop circles. And there's some other new ideas and topics that are being bantered around that we need to get some explanation for, like foggles. Do you know what foggles are? Well, you're going to find out tonight. And alien big cats, black-eyed children, contactees. A lot of great stuff in tonight's discussion for sure. I think that's all. One more thing, very, very important thing, actually. Very, very important thing. I want to say thank you to Christine Stroh. Christine is a new Patreon supporter for the program, and we welcome her to that group of elite folks and thank her very much. Thank you, Christine, for doing that and being a supporter of the program. That helps us out greatly. And if you're interested in doing that, just go to Patreon and search for Johaw, Johaw. That is our page, and you can support us there. And also, if you're listening as a podcast listener, there is a link in the description of the podcast that'll allow you to do the same thing, except that takes you right to the anchor.fm where our podcast is hosted and allows you to support us through that particular platform. All right, that does cover all the things I wanted to mention before we get started tonight. So we'll go to break, and when we come back, we will bring in our guest, Nick Redfern. We're talking about UFOs, aliens, crop circles, and other paranormal topics tonight. Hey, everybody, thanks for listening to Beyond Reality Paranormal. I'm your host, J.V. Johnson. I'm going to ask that you support this program. The easiest way to do that, by the way, is if you're listening as a podcast, you just open up the description of the episode and you scroll down to the bottom. And at the bottom, there is a link that says support this podcast. If you click on that, you'll be taken to a page that gives you a couple of options for supporting the show. We greatly appreciate it. It helps us bring great programs to you every week, and we look forward to continuing to do that. And if you're enjoying the program on YouTube, there's another way you can support the show. Just go to the description. You'll see a link to a Patreon page. It's Johaw, Johaw. And if you go to the Patreon page, you'll be able to pledge an amount to help support the show as well. Once again, thanks for your support. Thank you for listening. Please share it with your friends. Our guest tonight, Nick Redfern. He's an author. He's a paranormal researcher. He's written so many books, and we're going to get into many of them, including the Alien book, A Guide to Extraterrestrial Beings on Earth, Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, Chupacabra Road Trip, One Man's Hunt for Vampires. And his website is nickredfernfortean.blogspot.com. Nick, welcome back to Beyond Reality. Great to have you here with us tonight.
Hey, man. Thanks for having me on again.
You know, there are a lot of people that are new to our program as we've continued to grow, and they might not know about your work. I mean, which is kind of hard to believe if you've been anywhere in the paranormal universe. You've heard of Nick Redfern. But for those that don't know who you are, what you do, how'd you get started in this?
Well, I got interested, I guess, as a kid, and my parents took me on a vacation to Scotland when I was about 6 years old, and we went to Loch Ness. You know, if you're going to go to Scotland, you've got to go to Loch Ness.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even as that age, I still have a few fragments of memories of my dad telling me the story of these strange Loch Ness monsters, and it really sort of captured my attention even at that age. And the reason why, as well, my dad wanted to go was because he served in the British Royal Air Force, which is like the equivalent of the U.S. Air Force here.
Sure.
And he was a radar mechanic, and he actually was involved in 3 radar-based UFO cases when he was in the service. And so it was those sort of combinations that really got me interested, and I started reading books on the subject when I was about of the paranormal and UFOs and Bigfoot and you name it. I probably started reading books when I was 12, 13, something like that. And then after school, I just didn't know what I wanted to do. I wasn't the best student, to put it tactfully, and I just didn't know what to do. All I knew was that I didn't want to have a job that I hated, and I didn't want to have to wear a suit, which don't really go well with me. And so I actually got a job on an entertainment magazine in England, where I lived at the time, magazine called Zero, and I did a lot of the music-based stuff, and I still do a lot of that now, sort of interviewing bands and reviewing concerts, that kind of thing. And I did that for a few years, and then I thought, well, why not try and apply the sort of journalistic approach that I'd been taught on the magazine? Why not try and combine that with the interest in the paranormal and sort of take an investigative journalistic approach to investigated weird things? And that sort of brought me from Scotland at the age of 5 or 6 to the present day. So.
You know, one thing you said there about not wearing a suit, it doesn't really go well for you. I did that for a lot of years. I owned a company where I had to wear a suit and tie every day. I'll never do it again, Nick. I'm not doing it ever again. I'm with you now. I've seen the light when it comes to that. I need to ask you about Loch Ness a little bit. I was asked the other night what my opinion is of sea monsters in general or water monsters in general, and Loch Ness came up. And I expressed a little bit of disappointment to this guest that after all this time, we haven't been able to get anything more concrete, with the exception of maybe there's an argument to be made for this latest, I don't know what you call it, this DNA test that was done from the water of Loch Ness, and they found a tremendous amount of eel DNA. But beyond that, we haven't had any real progress in the search for that particular creature. What are your thoughts on Loch Ness right now?
Well, the problem when it comes to Loch Ness, and also, you know, a lot of lakes where they're alleged to be strange creatures, you know, is the sheer size of them. For example, I mean, Loch Ness is roughly 22 miles long, about a mile wide, and at its deepest, around about 700 feet deep. And a lot of people don't realise that the water itself is almost black. It's extremely dark and thick with peat and mud and dirt. And if you add to that the fact that, you know, not many people see these creatures, which suggests that, you know, they're probably not reptiles like a crocodile or an alligator, which has to surface every so often, you know, like every 45 minutes, 30 minutes to take in oxygen. These things are seen so, or hardly ever. So the likelihood is there's some sort of fish, you know, which gets its oxygen out of the water through its gills. So I think the primary reason why we're not seeing these things is because they hardly ever surface. And given the fact that it's like 22 miles long and there may not be that many of them, you'd really have to be in the right place at the right time when they surface and stay up long enough for you to see one or photograph one. But over the years, there have been some interesting pictures. But, you know, it's like I said, when you're talking about sort of massive bodies of water and these things hardly ever surfacing, it isn't really that surprising that we wouldn't see them so much. You know, if they were something that, you know, like us, where they have lungs, where they've got to keep coming up, you'd be seeing them all the time. But we're not, you know. I mean, a lot of people may not realise that there are only usually about 5 or 6 good, solid cases per year. You know, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 photographs, and that really is it. And, of course, you've got the logistics angle. You know, a lot of people who have got a big passion for Nessie seeking, you know, they might have a full-time job, which means they can only take a week or 2 off from their regular job. Or, you know, if you want to get down to the bottom of the loch, you know, and with a submarine, a mini submarine, which a number of people have done, well, you know, imagine the cost of what it must be to hire a submarine.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
So there's actually like the logistics and the elusiveness of the creatures themselves, I think. But the DNA scientific study that you're talking about is an interesting one, because some researchers think that the Loch Ness Monsters are like giant eels. Now, we're not talking about regular eels, which can grow up to sort of 6, 8, 10, 12 feet in length, and there have been rumours of eels growing to like 14 or 15, 16 feet. But in these cases, people are sort of postulating that we're talking about giant eels of maybe 30 feet in length. But of course, you know, the Loch Ness eel doesn't sound as cool as the Loch Ness Monster. But I don't think anybody would sort of disagree that if you're sort of out in a boat on Loch Ness and you see a 35 to 40 foot long eel with a body, you know, the size of an oil drum charging towards you, you probably wouldn't disagree that that's not a monster, you know, or it's a monster, I should say. So you're right when you said earlier about the finding a lot of eel DNA in Loch Ness. That's interesting. The only sort of negative side of it is that DNA can tell you what it is that you found. DNA analysis can tell you what you found, but you cannot get any sense of the size of the animal. You know, if you took DNA from an eel that was 30 feet long, and then you took it from another one that was 2 feet long, there would be no difference.
Right.
Size has no difference, you know, when it comes to DNA study. So, you know, the idea that they could be giant eels is possible, but the only problem is that eels, you know, they're basically like a long body, and what they cannot do is raise their heads and necks out of the water. They don't have sufficient muscles to do that. And so that's one thing against the eel theory. And, like, you know, the one theory that everybody likes, and particularly the Scottish Tourist Board, is the idea that they're plesiosaurs, surviving reptiles from the Jurassic dinosaur era. There's two problems with the plesiosaur theories. One is the fact that they were just like crocodiles and alligators. They were marine reptiles, so they would have to surface like every 25, 30 minutes. You know, crocodiles can actually hold their breath a long time, and so it makes sense that plesiosaurs probably could as well. So if you've got a colony of, say, 10 or 12 in Loch Ness at any time, and they're all surfacing every half an hour, if they're plesiosaurs, you should be seeing them a lot, you know, a huge amount. So that kind of, you know, sort of crosses off the board the plesiosaur angle. And I'm sort of inclined to go with the idea, two ideas. One is that they're a type of animal that we actually haven't found yet, you know, something that science hasn't classified at all. And the other theory, which is an interesting one, which I wrote an entire book on, was the idea that some researchers and witnesses think these creatures are more sort of supernatural than they are flesh and blood animals. You know, the idea of something sort of paranormal. For example, there have been sightings where people have tried to take pictures of the Loch Ness Monsters and the cameras have suddenly jammed. People talk about these creatures in very different ways. Some describe them as like a plesiosaur. One witness described it as like a tusked animal. Another one as like a giant worm, almost as if they were almost like shapeshifters, you know, sort of supernatural shapeshifters. So there's a lot of interesting theories and ideas, but we've got a lot of data over the years and the decades and the centuries. But I have to admit, you know, we are sort of lacking in solid answers.
That supernatural theory that you just mentioned, as it relates to Nessie, seems to be being floated for many of these things that we haven't been able to explain or find, like Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or things like Chupacabra. It's starting to appear that this might be the reason so many of these creatures are so elusive. What do you think about this theory applying to other things?
Well, yeah, I actually do go along that path for the most part. I mean, the book that I wrote on Nessie, which has got the stunningly original title of Nessie. That one actually focuses on the supernatural aspect of the story. For example, the famous occultist Aleister Crowley actually had a house on the shores of Loch Ness called Boleskine House when he lived there in the early part of the 20th century. And he performed all sorts of rites and rituals to try and summon up, if you like, supernatural beings or entities from the loch. And it wasn't long after that that you had the large waves started to begin of sightings of the Loch Ness Monsters. And as I said, there are some weird cases of people, trying to photograph these things and the cameras don't work, or there's a sudden drop in battery power, at totally inconvenient times. There's so many cases like that, and there have also been a lot of UFO sightings over Loch Ness as well. And you can also, as you mentioned, you brought up like Bigfoot. Although most people who investigate things like Bigfoot, people who are known as like cryptozoologists, but I prefer like a term like monster hunt. You say you're a cryptozoologist, people go, huh?
Yeah, right.
So I like to go with the term monster hunter. But again, with Bigfoot, there have been a lot of weird reports where people have seen Bigfoot-type creatures in the woods, and they've seen these strange balls of light flitting around the creatures, and even reports of these animals vanishing in the flash of light as if they've sort of jumped from our reality to like another dimension or something like that. So my view is that one of the reasons why some of these creatures may be not just elusive, but almost too elusive, could be that they're not necessarily always in our reality. I mean, things like quantum physics today are sort of allowing for the existence of multiple dimensions and multiple realities. And so, the idea that these things could kind of jump in and out of our reality is one that kind of interests me, and the same with the chupacabra. I did a book a few years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, called Chupacabra Road Trip, which was basically like a diary of all the expeditions I've been on to Puerto Rico and Brazil and Mexico looking for the chupacabra, and in that particular case, in relation to the chupacabra, again, a lot of the local people in Puerto Rico full-on believe that the chupacabra are some sort of supernatural creature rather than just an unknown animal that science hasn't found yet.
Theories aside, have we made any significant progress in the search or verification of the existence of some of these creatures?
Well, I mean, we have, in the sense that we've got photographs and we've got audio recordings, and of course we've got witness testimony, but it's inevitable that people are going to say, well, that photograph's faked, or that guy's dressed in an ape suit, that kind of thing. And I understand that people want validation in the sense of hard evidence, and I have to admit that we don't have that. And again, I think one of the reasons is because they're not what they necessarily seem to be or are assumed to be. I mean, if you look again at Bigfoot, I mean, most people describe these things as being sort of 7 to 8 feet tall, maybe 300 to 400 pound, and they've been seen all across the United States. But we've never caught one. One's never ran across the road and got hit by a truck, etc., etc. These things seem to be beyond elusive. And of course, in a country as advanced as the United States, you would think by now we would have caught at least one 8-foot-tall monster roaming around the US. Right. It doesn't seem feasible that creatures that huge could be not found, or caught or captured. So again, I think that's a good, valid reason to suggest there's more or less to these creatures when it comes to trying to figure out what they are. and there've been a lot of weird reports as well where these creatures have been seen around like ancient sacred sites, like these old mounds you can find in Wisconsin and places like that. And there have even been sightings of Bigfoot-type creatures in some of the old ancient stone circles in the UK. Not round Stonehenge, I should stress, but there's a lot of much smaller ones, and there have been sightings of similar creatures there, which, again, kind of puts more of a mysterious aspect onto this. Now, a lot of cryptozoologists don't like to go down this paranormal pathway. They want to really sort of steer it constantly down the path that suggests they're just unknown animals or animals that we think are extinct but that may not have become extinct. And that could actually be the case. But with these kind of rogue, weirder cases, I think we're dealing with creatures that are far more supernatural than they are just like the American equivalent of an African gorilla or whatever.
Nick, we have, at least in the United States, moved toward what would be considered to be a common situation where people have dash cams. And I also know that a lot of times when I hear people give me a report of sighting a Bigfoot, it's frequently when they're driving. They'll say something crossed the road or was standing on the side of the road. I mean, it's often from the vantage point of an automobile on a roadside or crossing the road. These dash cams that are now becoming popular with people may very well catch some footage that has been elusive for so long.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, there are... when it comes to lake monsters and Bigfoot and things like that, there are actually a lot of pictures. The problem is a lot of people just dismiss them.
Sure.
And they mainly dismiss them because, well, Bigfoot can't exist, so the picture's got to be fake,
Right.
Which is kind of a bit of a skewed logic. But what I would say is that, there are obviously some pictures which and footage clearly fake just because somebody wants to get hits on YouTube or whatever. But in saying that, there are more than a handful of photographs which I think do stand the test of time and which do depict something that was seen in the woods. But, I guess it's kind of like being, people say, well, why doesn't everybody take a picture? I kind of draw a parallel with, if you're driving down the street or walking down the street and you suddenly see like the world's worst car accident, two cars slamming into each other, one catches fire, somebody's in the car and screaming. Some people will run to help, other people will stand there just in a total panic, not knowing what to do. And I kind of think to see a Bigfoot close up might actually, even for me, be similar to that. Like your normal thinking functions go totally out of the window. To give you a classic and kind of graphic example, this is kind of strange, but it does explain the point I'm making. I know of actually 3 cases where hunters actually saw one of these. I should stress they were all totally separate, different parts of the US. Saw one of these things literally sort of up close and personal and stood there, and all 3 just peed themselves.
Wow.
Yeah, because it was just such a shock.
Sure.
And I kind of think that may be the reason why you expect people to get pictures, but they don't, because the sheer shock of seeing an 8-foot-tall human ape-like looking thing staring at you, 400 pounds and towering over you by about 2 feet or whatever. I can understand why sometimes people don't think to get their phone out. That might be at the very last part of their mind. They might be thinking, am I about to be torn apart? And they don't even have the ability to run. Their legs are just stuck, glued to the ground. So I think, that has some merit, the idea that the shock factor may actually sometimes have an issue, when it comes to try and capture a picture.
Yeah, I think often those that are critical of people that don't get pictures when they're in that situation tend to discount the fact that, it usually is only an encounter that lasts a couple seconds. Mm-hmm. And when you are startled and surprised and bewildered by what you're seeing, a couple seconds isn't a long enough time for you to gather yourself, pull out a camera, unless you're specifically out there looking and, trying and pointing the camera and trying to find something. You're probably not going to have enough time to snap that photo. So it's certainly conceivable and understandable how that can happen. Let's kind of turn to the alien front. What's the latest, Nick, in sightings of aliens, or maybe even just as people looking to the skies, sightings of UFOs on unexplained craft?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's so much sightings that have got people really interested in the last year or two. It's the sort of the revelations that at the end of 2017, when the New York Times broke this story, basically saying that the U.S. government had got this sort of hidden UFO program, UFO research program, that everybody assumed, as the Air Force had said, that they got out the UFO game in the late 60s when they shut down their Project Blue Book. And then to find at the end of 2017 that there was this sort of carefully run and quietly funded, etc. And it was only when, as I said, the media broke the story that it suddenly became clear that, well, the government is still investigating UFOs. And then, of course, various pieces of footage and photographs surfaced out of this program where there was evidence of pilots seeing some of these things and pursuing them. And I think what has happened in the last sort of 2 years ago is that the UFO subject, which for so many years has had a lot of followers, thousands and thousands, but it's always, I think, been seen as a little bit of a, just sort of a fringe, weird topic until we now know that the government's been pursuing this for a long, long time. And I think now what's been seen is the mainstream media has started to take this seriously because they realise, we're not talking about somebody sees a UFO, and they roll out the bar at midnight on a Friday night, after a few drinks. We're talking about qualified pilots, that kind of thing. So I think, as I said at the beginning of that question, or the answer to the question, I don't think it's so much a growth in UFOs. It's more of a realization that this subject is taken seriously within government and the military. So I think that more than anything else has been the big change. And, that reflects as well in a lot of channels on TV like Travel Channel, Discovery, History, all of whom in the last year or so put out a lot of UFO-themed documentaries and series.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something very, very important there, and that is that there seems to be a thawing in the attitude of whether it's the people controlling what the pilots and what the military pilots say, or it's just the pilots themselves. I know there's a combination, but it's not just military pilots that are starting to come forward and say, yeah, I fly all the time, and I've seen this, and I've seen this, and I've seen this, and we can't explain it.
Well, I think there's part of it like that. I think it's like a lot of things in life. Nobody wants to say anything until somebody else starts it, and then they all join in. So I think there's a degree of that. And particularly, pilots, they don't want to, even I have to admit this, they don't want to be known as the pilot who sees little green men. So I can easily understand why for years pilots, and particularly probably airline pilots, don't want to say, hey, I saw a UFO and, it chased us, or we chased it through the skies, that kind of thing. But now that is sort of changing. So I think there's that. I think part of it is, when somebody comes forward, it brings other people forward, and they feel more comfortable talking about it. There's definitely that side to it. But then you have some people in what's called the UFO disclosure movement, people who believe that the government is sort of subtly and slowly releasing bit-by-bit information so that one day they'll reveal the truth, and it won't be too much of a mind-blowing thing because they've been sort of deliberately leaking material, is as a means to get us climatized to the idea that UFOs and aliens do exist. We're in sort of interesting times now, in relation to UFOs, where we don't really know where it's all going, but I think there is this sense that in the last couple of years things have started to open up, and of course the big question is, why is it opening up? It's not like the government has to reveal this material, so I think that's an interesting aspect as well. Perhaps, the idea that one day, we might have all the answers, not because it's suddenly thrown in our face, but bit by bit, we all become used to the idea that something's going on, and then maybe they reel out something which is undeniable. The bodies of 4 or 5 dead aliens from 20, 30 years ago preserved in tanks, that kind of thing. That sort of, if the government really does have sort of that kind of evidence, and it was put out there for people to see, that would be. That would be amazing. And I'd probably have to get another job then, be out of a job.
What's your opinion, though? There are several different degrees that could exist when it comes to government knowledge of this. One is just that the government has evidence that these things exist, whether it's just craft or it's actual aliens on the ground. 2 is that they actually have physical evidence of their existence, and 3 is that they're actually not only aware of them, but they're talking to them and striking deals with them and sharing technology with them or from them. Which of those 3 degrees do you think is most likely?
Well, that's a good question. What I would say for sure is that it very much depends on who you ask, even within government. I mean, for example, you've got old-timers who, in their 90s, literally in their 90s now, who were out at Roswell, and who claim to have been at the crash site, and, the family relatives talk about how their grandfather swore that he saw these little bodies out at the ranch in Roswell where this UFO supposedly came down. But then the Air Force are absolutely adamant that nothing of an alien nature came down at Roswell. If you ask the Air Force what came down at Roswell, they claim it was what was called a mogul balloon, the huge, gigantic balloons that were sent up in the late 40s to monitor for early Russian atomic bomb tests. And that's what the Air Force says the answer is. And they say that the bodies that everybody said were aliens were actually crash test dummies used in high-altitude parachute experiments. So, on the one hand, you've got the military's old-timers saying, yes, they saw these strange creatures, and the Air Force saying, no, you saw crash test dummies. So even within government and retired, government people, there is this sort of glaring difference between who you ask. As I said, the Air Force don't go with any of this with Roswell. The old-timers do. Area 51, the government says what's going on at Area 51 is just the testing of new and strange-looking aircraft that are still on the sort of development stage and that look like UFOs. But then you've had people who've come forward who claim to have worked there, and they said, no, there are UFOs out there and dead aliens, stored away, that kind of thing. So, I think what this demonstrates is that, when people think of the government, they think of like one unified body. But it's not like that. You've got like the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, the NSA, the CIA, Defense Intelligence Agency. The list goes on and on and on. And, of course, within government, there's the concept of what's called need to know. In other words, just because you work in the CIA or the NSA, if your job doesn't require you to know about a particular thing like UFOs, you won't know. It's not like you join the CIA and you're suddenly told on what happened at Roswell. That would be ridiculous.
Right.
And that's the way secrets are kept, is that you're only told what you need to know to do your job. So when government agencies say, no, we don't know anything about aliens at Roswell, I honestly don't believe they're lying. But that doesn't mean that some agency deeply buried into the government infrastructure, that agency may actually know, but the number of people who know is so small because the bigger the program, the more likely it's going to leak out. So I think people don't realize that sometimes people within the government don't actually know what the government knows. Which sounds strange, but that is how secrets are kept very often.
And, we all automatically talk about the U.S. government, the U.S. federal government. What other foreign nations? Do we hear anything from any other country about this topic?
Oh, yeah. I mean, since the early 1990s, the UK government have declassified somewhere in the region of several thousand pages of documents of UFO sightings going back to the 1950s. And there are a handful of reports from pilots where, interestingly enough, the pilots saw these sort of classic flying saucers. This one I'm talking about now is a 1957 case where sort of a classic flying saucer type craft was seen by the pilot of an aircraft off the coast of England, and the ground radar operators were tracking it at the same time. So that was sort of, where you'd got two different types of evidence. And those files, like a lot of the US files, were classified and held away for years. But the UK, Australia, France, Brazil, particularly Brazil, the Brazilian Air Force have released over the years a huge amount, and they're extremely open with their files, and also New Zealand. We're not seeing too much coming out of China, and there's sort of a limited amount coming out of Russia. But, a lot of the other countries have started to become quite open, in relating to the general public and saying, okay, we realize, maybe it should have been classified 50 years ago, but now it's something that's of interest to people, and maybe there's no national security issue, so here's the files. That's literally how it's kind of started to go.
I'm your host, J.V. Johnson. Thank you for being with us tonight. A couple quick things to talk about, then we'll get back to our discussion with our guest, Nick Redfern. First of all, I want to thank Christine Stroh for being a supporter on our Patreon page. Thank you for doing that, Christine, and helps us bring the program to you. We really do appreciate it, and welcome you to our community. The other thing is, speaking of our community, make sure you go to YouTube and find our YouTube channel. That's where we stream live. That's where you get a little bit of a video feed for whatever that's worth. Plus, there's about 500 back episodes of Beyond Reality on that page. You can find a lot of great stuff there. So again, just go to YouTube and search for J.V. Johnson. When you find it, please subscribe. And make sure that you check out all of the bonus content plus the back episodes. And if you click the notification icon when you subscribe, you will be notified when we go live and when we upload new content, whether it's bonus stuff or something extra, whatever we happen to put up there. So it's always a great way to do it. Also, you can subscribe to the podcast version of the show on any major podcast platform. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, tune in. There's a whole bunch of them. Wherever you happen to enjoy your podcast, you should be able to find Beyond Reality Paranormal there as well. Tonight, we're talking with Nick Redfern. He's an author, a paranormal researcher. He's here to talk about aliens, UFOs, crop circles, and anything we happen to bring up, which we've already crossed many topics that I don't think we intended to be chatting about, Nick. But it's always fun to have you on the program because we can talk about anything, and that just makes the night fly by.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where I cover a lot of ground, whether it's Bigfoot, UFOs, Chupacabra, aliens, some supernatural stuff. I'm not really into ghost stuff. It doesn't really interest me that much. So, but yeah, if there's anything's a bit weird, I'll give it a tackle. So
we have we were talking about Area 51 a bit before the break, and I just have to ask you about this because back in the late summer, early part of the fall, there was this big storm Area 51 thing. It turned out to be a lot of nothing in the end of the day, but for a long time, there were millions of people that were lending support to this idea that people should just en masse try to break into Area 51 and see what's actually there. What are your thoughts about that? Not the necessarily the fact that people were going to storm the gates, but more importantly, that there are so many people that seemed very, very motivated to get some real answers.
Well, I think one of the reasons is because just about everybody, has heard of Area 51. It's kind of like these weird situations. It's a top secret base, but everybody's heard of it.
Right.
You don't find that very often. And it's almost unique, or possibly it is unique, in terms of how you literally cannot get within like 15, 16 miles of the base itself, and it's surrounded by mountains, and 24/7 there are guards, and they have motion detector equipment, which can actually detect the difference between a human sort of, creeping across the desert at night versus a jackrabbit or something like that. So, it's extremely well guarded. And, of course, it's got this legend of crashed and retrieved UFOs stored away at Area 51. So everybody's heard about this, and the one big intriguing aspect is that you don't have to be into UFOs to have heard of Area 51. You can ask anyone, what's Area 51? And they'll say that's where the UFOs are stored or where the aliens live, that kind of thing. So, Area 51 has very much become part of pop culture, which you would never think a military base would achieve that kind of status, if you like. But as far as it ties in, with the storming Area 51, my view is this, that if you want to sort of go out to the area and hang out, in a legal area, sort of, where the actual distance where you can legally walk to, if you want to sit out there and look at the sky with a couple of beers, and your friends out there, I don't think there's anything wrong with that because you're not breaking any laws. But my view is that given particularly the state the world's in right now, I don't think anyone should be encouraging anyone to invade, literally storm, use that word, to storm a U.S. military base. If it was any other, this started on Facebook, when this one guy basically whipped up all this interest, and it got to this point where people were talking about, well, let's storm Area 51, and people were saying, well, cool, we'll find the aliens. Well, you imagine if just any other military base in the US, somebody said, we're going to storm this base and we're going to storm that base. Like I said, I don't think in the way the world is today, no one at all should be encouraging anyone to storm any U.S. base because you're just asking for trouble. You jump the fence in a military base today. Don't blame the guys the other side of the fence
right.
if they shoot you,
right.
because for all they know, you're a terrorist.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And it that whole thing kind of petered out in the end, and they didn't get nearly the crowds they thought they were going to get. In fact, we had a guest on who was having a festival at one of the locations near the base, and they were talking about how tickets were selling like crazy or whatever. And it turns out they opened it on Friday of that weekend, and they closed by the end of Friday evening and never reopened because there were so few people there. So it didn't really turn out to be what they thought.
Well, I think part of the reason was there was this realization that people, when they looked at it in sort of, an open fashion, they realized people being encouraged, like I said, to invade a U.S. military base. And if it wasn't Area 51, no one would even think about doing something like that. You just would not do it. But for some reason, people think it's okay to do it with this ultra-secret base, Area 51. And as I said, you do something like that, well, in today's world, you're liable to come back, with a bullet in your head because, for all we know, people who claim to have been UFO researchers, I mean, some of them, this might sound a bit paranoid, but some of those people who are out there may well have been sort of,
sure,
somebody spying on what was going on. And if they're pulled over, they'd just say, oh, we're just UFO guys, and the cops will just say, on your way, But, there could be that sinister side to it as well.
Let's talk about your book, The Alien Book, A Guide to Extraterrestrial Beings on Earth. I mean, those last few words say a whole lot. Are there extraterrestrial beings here on Earth, Nick?
Well, I think there are, because I think there's been so many good, solid reports of people who claim to have seen sort of strange creatures, aliens, whatever you want to call them, coming out of UFOs, that kind of thing, and stories like alien abductions. But the main reason why I wanted to write the book was because, when you think of aliens, it's kind of like Area 51. Everybody's got an image of Area 51. Everybody's got an image of what an alien looks like. You give a pencil and paper to a 5-year-old kid and say, draw an alien. They'll draw like a big head and black eyes and like a little body. Everybody kind of knows aliens. That's how they're supposed to look. But over the decades, there have been numerous different types of aliens have been reported. And so I thought, well, why not write a book in sort of A to Z style that details all the different types of aliens that witnesses claim to have seen. And the majority do fall into that category of like the small creatures with the large heads and the black eyes. But people have described seeing sort of reptilian type creatures, aliens that look very much like us. You name it, they've sort of been seen. You have creatures that have become part of pop culture, if you like Mothman, based on John Keel's book, The Mothman Prophecies, which was made into a movie with Richard Gere. So, there's a sort of a huge variation on what people, define as an alien, what it looks like. So I thought, why not do sort of the top 50 sort of different types of aliens that people have reported, and the cases that they related to, and what these entities might actually be.
We have had reports of creatures that are near human looking, but with slight differences. And in fact, you even brought up the Mothman story. And part of the Mothman story is the fact that there were what appeared to be humans that weren't quite right. If they can blend in well enough that you'd have to take a couple glances to be able to see any differences, they very well could be walking among us and we wouldn't know it. If they are this more what we would consider a traditional-looking, big eyes, big head, little body thing, they're not going to be able to hide among the population very well. No. What do you think we've got going on here? Which kind?
Well, I mean, we could have, sort of numerous different things going on at the same time. I think a lot of people, just if you're interested in these things or you just, take a casual interest, you might think, oh, they all just look like this. But you're right, there are some which, in theory, could sort of maneuver among us, and we wouldn't know. I mean, this actually relates to almost sort of perfectly to the Men in Black mystery. Now, if you mention the Men in Black to anyone, the first thing they'll think of is Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones.
Sure, yeah. From
the movies. But a lot of people don't realize that the movies were actually based on real-life reports of people who claimed that after seeing a UFO, they were visited by these strange Men in Black. Now, whereas in the movies, the Men in Black were, secret agents of a secret agency silencing people in relation to UFOs. The real Men in Black, the stories of which go back to the early 1950s. The first book on the Men in Black was actually written in 1956. It was called They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers, written by a guy named Gray Barker. And most of the witnesses to the real Men in Black, going back to the 50s, have described the MIB as looking sort of very human-looking, but very pale and skinny, and they have this, the skin kind of looks like plastic, or as one witness described it, they said as if the person looked like they'd overdone the Botox, you know. They looked like a mannequin's kind of face. And they also had sort of these bulging eyes and kind of like an anemic look to them as well. And the witnesses said that, you know, very often they would wear these old-style fedora hats and wrap-around sunglasses, and that they could see these bulging eyes sort of hiding behind the sunglasses, as if the fedoras and the sunglasses were deliberately designed so people wouldn't get a full look at them and they wouldn't think, wow, you know, what's wrong with that person? So you've got stories like this of the MIB that, you know, they could probably pass you in the streets if you didn't look too closely at them. And, you know, if you walk by them at night, you probably wouldn't notice anything strange. But get close up to them, then people realize, wow, these people actually don't look like people. So that's sort of a perfect example of the one type of alien that a lot of the witnesses report, this sort of very human-looking being, but with a few differences that would really make you sort of look twice.
Do you think this human-looking being that would be alien in nature is showing itself in its natural form, or do you think they have some kind of shape-shifting ability? Or is it more of some type of prosthetic?
Well, actually, that prosthetic angle is one that's been reported on a number of occasions where, and again, particularly with the Men in Black cases, some of the witnesses felt that when they were looking at these Men in Black, it actually did look like sort of prosthetics, as if, you know, almost like someone who had, you know, like the face damaged or burned, and, you know, they'd had surgery or prosthetics added on. Some of the witnesses actually said something almost, you know, identically to that. But again, the shapeshifter angle that you brought up, that's an interesting one, because there are some cases, and this gets really weird and bizarre, particularly in relation to the stories of these so-called reptilians, sort of upright sort of reptile, lizard-type creatures, that people claim to have seen them sort of shape-shift from a human form into like an upright reptilian form. Now, of course, as I'm sure as you might know, there have been these rumours and stories, which I don't personally believe, but, you know, that the idea that the British royal family are reptilians,
right.
You know, that's sort of one of the big conspiracy theories, but even I don't go that far. But there's no doubt that there is like a very large following for that particular theory. You know, you can find message boards, you know, chat rooms, you name it. And I'm not a particular fan of the royal family. I'm not doing it to defend them. I just think the whole scenario is a little bit over the top. But, you know, people do talk about these things sort of shape-shifting from human to reptilian and back again, and for me, I would say that's at the very far end of the credibility aspect of all this. But I think, you know, if, like I hope I am, you know, you work on things with a rational head on your shoulders, you know, you have to be honest and say, look, okay, I think this is feasible, but I think that's garbage. You know, you cannot just accept every story sort of wide, you know, your eyes wide open and your mouth wide open, you know, just amazed. You've got to investigate these cases as I do in the same way that I would investigate any kind of story for like a newspaper or for an online magazine, that kind of thing. You have to be grounded and careful what you accept, particularly when it comes to stories that might be provided anonymously, and the last thing you need is some joker trying to pull the wool over your eyes.
If, in fact, there are aliens walking among us, what is their intention, do you think, Nick? Are they here for benevolent purposes, nefarious purposes, just observing? What do you think they're doing?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is that I haven't seen any hard evidence that they've actually helped us. I mean, arguably the world's in a pretty bad state right now in various ways.
Right.
Whether it's, just the state of the world, in terms of just fighting, battling, conflicts, and also, weird weather, that kind of thing, pollution, and so on. So I haven't seen any evidence that they've tried to intervene and do something about all that. But from the other angle, I also haven't seen hard evidence that they've acted in a highly dangerous way either. And I think they probably do fall into sort of like a self-preservation aspect. In other words, like us, they look after number one, and that doesn't mean they're out to destroy us or take over the planet. But, if you look at the alien abduction stories, a lot of the witnesses claim that when they were abducted and taken on board UFOs, that like DNA and skin and cells and blood and saliva was taken from them, as if the goal was possibly to, use our DNA as a means to beef up their DNA. There are stories about the so-called greys, these smaller aliens with the big heads and the black eyes. Stories that perhaps their lineage, if you like, is starting to degrade, and they need to, as I said, beef up their DNA, if you like. And if our DNA is compatible with theirs, then possibly, they could actually derive something from us to allow them to survive. So a lot of the abduction stories do seem to revolve around medical experimentation, DNA, cells, and a lot of researchers do believe that there is some sort of, almost like a hybrid agenda at work to allow these creatures to stay alive.
Do you find any legitimacy in what I'm hearing more often, these ideas that aliens, the ancient alien idea, that aliens came here a long time ago and may have mated with the early human population to create what we would know today as modern human?
Well, yeah, this is one of the more controversial ones, and really, you can push it. You can push the same story down two pathways. For example, you look at early ancient religious texts. They talk about the giants coming down from the sky and mating with the human women, and people have suggested that the giants that you can find in numerous different types of ancient religious texts, people have suggested they could be aliens. And in the same fashion, some researchers have said that things like the Star of Bethlehem was not a star, but it was a UFO hovering over Bethlehem, that kind of thing. So I think, the one problem is that the older and older the story, the more and more difficult it is to solve anything. And you are basically forced to either sit on one of the two sides, there's three sides. You either believe in the religious side of it, you believe in the alien side of it, or you think it's just stories. And again, it depends on which side you're on. But I mean, there's no doubt that today, the whole kind of ancient alien scenario has a massive following. It's in an ironic sense, it's almost like it's becoming like a religion itself. So I think to some degree, one of the reasons why I think there is such an interest in the ancient astronaut aspect is because for a lot of people who, we all live in a hugely technological world, for a lot of people, it kind of resonates with them in the sense that, comparing our technology today with what may have been technology in the distant past, you can see it in our world today. For example, look at the Old Testament story of the destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. There's like an entire crowd of people who believe that Sodom and Gomorrah were nuked by aliens.
Right.
So there's a lot of controversy when it comes to interpreting a lot of these ancient texts as this or as that.
Where can people get a hold of your books?
Well, all my books are available on Amazon, and around about 60% of them, you can get them off the shelves in Barnes & Noble.
And you have a lot of books to choose from, and I'm sure they're topic sensitive would be part of the answer to this question. But do you have any place that you recommend people start with your work?
That's a good question. I don't think I've ever been asked that. I would actually say I did one called The Real Men in Black, which people might find that interesting because it sort of demonstrates the reality behind Hollywood. And for people who are interested in the whole issue of like ancient aliens, I did one called Bloodline of the Gods, which sort of ties in with these theories about ancient aliens visiting the Earth, and for people who are into strange creatures, things like that. I did a book a couple of years ago called the Bigfoot Book, which is like an A to Z of everything you need to know about Bigfoot.
So black-eyed children, this is one of those phenomena that is rather rare, at least from what I understand. I've never had the experience myself, of course, but rather rare, but probably more intriguing than many others. So what's the deal with black-eyed children?
Well, yeah, this is sort of like a definitively supernatural or paranormal phenomenon. There's really no other category you can put it into. And stories of the black-eyed children have been sort of circulating quietly, actually for about 20 years now. But it's really only been in the last 5 or 6 years or so that the whole phenomenon has really taken off. And basically, it involves sightings of what are called the black-eyed children. And they're called the black-eyed children because witnesses describe their eyes as being like literally completely black, not just the center part, but the whole eye is solid black. Now, in almost every case on record, and I have literally dozens of cases, as does a friend of mine, David Weatherly, who wrote the sort of definitive book on the black-eyed children. Typically, the scenario is that people will get like a knock on the door late at night, and, like anyone, you think, who on earth's that at the door at this time of night? And so, people look through the little spy hole in the door, and they see usually 2 or 3 kids, almost always dressed in black hoodies and with their heads looking down. And this is where it gets weird. A lot of the witnesses claim they felt almost compelled or hypnotized to open the door. And so they open the door, and then you've got these kids with this sort of pale skin, not unlike the Men in Black, looking like almost like a Botox-type face, and with these huge black eyes. And they try and find a way to be invited into the house. We're lost. Can we come in and use the phone? We're homeless. Can we come in and have some food? And they never come into the house until they're invited, which actually ties in with the old legends of vampires that won't cross the threshold until they're invited.
Right.
Now, on the few occasions when people have, in this hypnotized state, allow them to come in, the witnesses have started to feel sort of weak and tired, almost as if, as some of the witnesses said it, almost as if they were being drained of their life force, of their energy. So it's a very bizarre and very sinister story of these sort of creepy kids demanding to come into the house and then sort of just draining the person of their, as I said, like their life force almost. And, it sounds like something for your, perfect horror movie, which I guess in some respects it actually is. But, I would write a lot of these stories off as like urban legend, was it not for the fact that there are so many credible stories. I mean, for example, the very first person who talked about this on the internet was a guy named Brian Bethel, who is a well-respected journalist in Texas, mainstream journalist, and he went public in the late 90s with his story. And Brian, he's a regular journalist, and he said he saw two of these kids right by his car, and he just got this really creepy vibe from them. And so when you've got people like Brian Bethel, you have to look at it again and realize that the people who are seeing these so-called black-eyed children are not weirdos, fantasists, hoaxers. They are everyday people put in a really weird situation.
There could be many possibilities for the source of this phenomena. Could be alien, but I'm more concerned with the possibility that it could be demonic in nature. Do we have any evidence that might support one way or another?
Oh, well, that's actually one of the big theories that a lot of researchers of the phenomenon have. The idea that we're dealing with something sort of definitively evil and, and as you said, like demonic in the way it's sort of, perceived, that term. But yeah, there's a lot of people who do believe that, this is something that's has almost been invoked, if you like, from sort of other hellish realm, that kind of thing. And a lot of the witnesses have said that they felt that when they saw the black-eyed children in front of them, they actually felt as if there was like an atmosphere of dread and an atmosphere of evil that they couldn't put their finger on it as to why there was this sort of air of evil. But that's what a lot of them have said. It was just a feeling of dread, a feeling of something terrible and unearthly.
Do we have any stories of these black-eyed children encounters where there was a religious symbol used to maybe ward them off or make them turn around or affect them in any way? Do we know anything like that?
Not really. The only way that I know from the witnesses to prevent them interacting with you is just not to let them in the house. But, as I said, in some cases, the witnesses felt as if they were being hypnotized and almost mind-controlled to open the door, which you would not normally do at, 11 o'clock at night and with a couple of kids outside dressed in hoodies. So that, there isn't really a way to stop it in those situations. But what I can tell you is that when I looked into the backgrounds of not all of them, but some of the witnesses to the black-eyed children, when I'd interviewed them, I should say, it turned out during the course of the interviews that perhaps a couple of weeks beforehand, they were sort of playing around with things like Ouija boards, or they, at some point, had dabbled in, sort of alternative magic and things like this, and also in some cases, joining occult groups. And some of them who walked away from these groups felt that the very fact that they got involved in these types of groups and people possibly opened a door that allowed the black-eyed children to come through. In other words, you start messing with the paranormal, then it starts to mess with you.
So if they open the door, does that mean that the black-eyed children then visited them, or are we talking about opening a door so these black-eyed children just come out and come through this portal, whatever it happens to be, a figurative door, and then roam wherever they want to and visit whoever they intend to?
Yeah, it's more the second category, where people are dabbling with the paranormal, and then they get the visit from the black-eyed children. In other words, it isn't always just like a random person who is targeted. Very often I've found, that the witnesses themselves were or had been sort of, digging into these controversial areas, and then they get the knock on the door. It's actually, if you to take a phrase from the Mothman prophecies that we mentioned earlier, one of the characters in the book says, "These things noticed you because you noticed them, and then they noticed you." So it's like a spiraling thing. You start to dig into this, and the phenomena seems to realize that you're looking for it, and then it turns the tables and basically gives you what you want, but in the worst way possible.
I know we talked about Area 51 a little while ago, but I have to ask you, what are foggles?
That's actually a really weird but interesting story. Area 51 is one of these places where, the government doesn't just want the public to know what's going on at Area 51. It's actually also its employees. Now, Area 51, it's called Area 51 because it's actually one of numerous areas in Nevada which have got designated different titles and different names. And so in some places, some of the staff are not allowed to go here and some aren't allowed to go there, etc., etc. And so they give them what they call are these froggles. They're kind of like foggles. They're like everyday goggles, but they have sort of the lower part of the lens of the goggles are fogged. Excuse me, the top part, I should say, is fogged. And the only way you can see to walk is to have your head down and looking at out of the lower part of the goggles. And so the top part is fogged, hence the term foggles. And so, in other words, you're forced, when you I should stress, all of the staff who work at Area 51 are flown out of Las Vegas' McCarran Airport back and forth. That's they work there like a week at a time. When they get off the planes, they have to put on the goggles and carefully sort of walk down the steps and across to whichever area they're working in. Or if it's an area that they don't normally work in, all the better in terms from security. So, if you imagine it, you've got these wraparound glasses or goggles, and you cannot see it all out of the half, the top half. So you're forced to look down because of the fogging, and all you can see is your shoes, and you're sort of carefully shuffled into the building. Then you can take your foggles off. So. That's like I don't know who came up with that, but it's kind of like an ingenious way of preventing from people from actually seeing what's going on the outside of the base, and that even includes the staff itself.
Nick, it's been a great discussion tonight. Thank you so much for being here. We're out of time. What's next on your plate?
Well, I've got a new book out in April called Assassinations, and it's like a history of assassinations throughout history, going right from like Julius Caesar and ancient Egypt, like who shot JFK, that kind of thing, and right up to the present day. So it's not like a paranormal type book. This one's slightly different, but it's more of a, who killed this person?
Do you get into
who assassinated that person?
Yeah. Do you get into the what ifs and possibilities, particularly as it comes to kind of conspiracy talk, or is this more of a historical?
I think sometimes people can go over the top too much with conspiracy stuff, and seeing a conspiracy around every corner. But some of the early fascinating ones, plots to kill Julius Caesar, and how the whole plan worked. These senators all got together and decided, you want him gone, we want him gone. let's get him gone, you know. So it's sort of fascinating story. And I've also got things like Jack the Ripper. You know, was he just a crazy guy, or was he, you know, assassinating people for a particular reason that might have sort of conspiracy attached to it? So there's, you know, a lot of different angles to, you know, things like who shot JFK. Was it the Russians? Was it, you know, was it the Cubans? Was it the mafia? You know, so the book's basically a study of 40 or 50 different cases, and then sort of looking at the different theories and ideas that might explain why the assassinations happened and who actually did it.
We'll have to have you back on when that book comes out, because
right,
it sounds like a great discussion. Nick, thanks so much for being here tonight. Great, had a great time, a lot of great information.
Well, thanks a lot. Had a good time.
Beyond Reality Paranormal is hosted by J.V. Johnson and produced by Orion Palmer and Slick Eddie Edwards. Like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please consider supporting the program either through your podcast platform, click on the link in the description, or on Patreon at Joha Productions. If you'd like to be a guest on Beyond Reality Paranormal, or you have a recommendation for a guest, contact our producer, Slick Eddie Edwards. Eddie is spelled with a Y, at slickeddieedwards@gmail.com.